Thank you for attending this speed round. What I'll be talking about is a paper that just appeared as a working paper in the UNU wider working paper series. It's joint work with Abdul Arumban. We're both at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And we'll talk about whether industrialization in developing countries relates to poverty reduction. Essentially, what I'm presenting here is a sequel to a presentation that I gave last year at the annual STEG conference. And that's the first one that's shown there. It's a paper where we used the new economic transformation database. And we observed that in several middle-income countries, such as Ghana and Nigeria, there appears to be a manufacturing renaissance in the sense that their share of industrial activity is measured in employment terms. So the manufacturing employment share has been starting to rise, roughly around the mid-2000s. And at the same time, in a lot of low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in developing Asia, we're observing a manufacturing naissance. So a rise in the manufacturing employment share in many low-income countries since the mid-2000s. And for sub-Saharan Africa, that appears to be largely resulting from employment expansion at small-scale manufacturing firms. It's the paper that we presented last year. And in this paper, it's basically a follow-up. And we asked the question, to what extent is this industrialization related to poverty reduction? There's a literature related to that that we aim to contribute to. You see at the bottom of this slide. Essentially, there are a few questions to ask. First of all, why would this industrialization, this reallocation of workers towards industry, be related to poverty reduction? Well, for one reason, it is because there's differences in productivity levels across sectors. So workers moving to sectors with higher productivity levels that tends to relate to higher wages as well, since there would be a reduction in poverty. On the other hand, if workers move out of what would be called surplus labor sectors, then the average income in those sectors would rise, also contributing then to poverty reduction. But it's not guaranteed that structural change would relate to poverty reduction, especially as there may be frictions that would impede poor people from relocating to higher productive sectors. And those type of frictions, some of were discussed before this session relating to skills, but it could also be other frictions, for example, those related to that actually manufacturing activities expand in different locations and poor people face difficulties in relocating to these areas. So essentially, whether structural change relates to poverty reduction is an empirical question. On the other hand, one may ask, why do actually sectors differ in their impact on poverty? Well, first of all, the benefits of growth are likely to more easily accrue to poor people if they're actually located in that particular sector. So there would be direct benefits if there would be productivity growth in sectors for those poor people that actually participate in that sector. And the participation of poor differs across economic sectors of the economy. At the same time, there can also be differences in labor intensity across sectors. For example, mining is well known to be actually labor extensive, and other sectors are much more labor intensive. And then finally, there's a sectoral productivity growth would interact with inequality. Think, for example, of productivity growth in agriculture. If land is very equally distributed, that would likely have a stronger poverty reducing effect than when land is very unequally distributed. So there are several reasons to argue and to look at why structural change in sectoral growth would relate to poverty reduction. And what we do here is essentially start with a very simple relationship where you have this change in poverty given by this P, related to any change in GDP per capita given by that Q in that first equation, and that phi would show you the semi-elasticity of poverty reduction if GDP per capita occurs. At GDP per capita, you can really simply rewrite it into the interaction of GDP per worker and labor force participation. That's shown in equation 2. And using that and using a decomposition proposed by Styro, we can actually rewrite equation 1 into an empirical equation we estimate given in equation 3, where poverty reduction is related to productivity growth that occurs within sectors. That's given by this beta 1 term. That beta 1 here is just given as, okay, any productivity within sectors. I don't have the time here now, but we can actually look at productivity growth for each of those sectors separately, and in that case, that beta 1 essentially become a beta I, right, for the particular sector in which productivity growth occurs. The second term shows you the contribution that would originate from reallocation, and that's given by this gamma. And then there's the contribution from changes in labor force participation, and there's a whole set of controls that we consider. In particular, what I'll discuss later on is the role of income inequality and how that matters in influencing poverty reduction. We use 3 sets of data here in this analysis. The first one is data on poverty, where we use the 1.9 PPP dollars a day headcount ratio. We look at poverty spells, so changes in the poverty ratio, poverty headcount ratio over time, and we use a data set proposed by Atamanov et al., where they actually aim to have a consistent change in this headcount ratio over time. As it's well known that there's changes in methodology or changes in sources that are being used to measure the headcount ratio. We use this database to have consistent poverty spells over time. One of our focuses is the relationship between structural change and poverty reduction. And for that reason, we focus on poverty spells that have at least 4 years of duration. We'll also consider poverty spells that have a longer duration. And we annualize those changes in the headcount ratio during those poverty spells. We end up with a data set where we have 119 poverty spells for 42 developing countries during the period from 1990 to 2018. All the data on inequality comes from the World Income Inequality Database, and then information on value added and employment in the different economic sectors of these developing economies comes from the July 2021 release of the Economic Transformation Database. These are the regression results, where the top one shows you the contribution that's originating from productivity growth that occurs within sectors that relates to poverty reduction. There's a subsequent row shows you the contribution that to productivity growth that originates from the reallocation of resources towards higher productive sectors. That is also contributing to poverty reduction, and the dummy where we, for countries in sub-Saharan Africa and a dummy for countries in developing Asia, suggests that this contribution of structural change is relatively stronger in developing Asia compared to the excluded category, which are all other developing countries, mainly those in Latin America, and it works less strongly in the case of sub-Saharan Africa. There's also a contribution originating from changes in income inequality, where if there would be an increase in income inequality, so a rise in the Gini coefficient, that would translate into actually lower poverty reduction. So there's a positive coefficient occurring there. Now, what we do is we have a longer regression where we actually look at the productivity growth within specific sectors, and we use that in an attribution exercise to calculate the predicted effects, where we use the data for each of those poverty spells in combination with the coefficient estimates to calculate what would be the predicted relation to poverty reduction. And what you see here is just a very simple unweighted average contribution for each of those variables, each poverty spell by region. And what emerges from that is that there appears to be a relation between poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa to productivity growth in agriculture, productivity growth due to the reallocation of resources to higher productivity levels, and improvements in the Gini coefficient, which is given by that red bar. There does not appear to be a strong relation between poverty reduction and productivity growth in manufacturing, and that directly comes from this expansion of manufacturing that originates from small-scale manufacturing, such that we observe very limited productivity growth in manufacturing. By contrast, if we do this attribution for developing Asia, we find that just like in sub-Saharan Africa, the productivity growth in agriculture has been contributing to poverty reduction. But there's a stronger effect observed for productivity in manufacturing, and also a stronger effect from the reallocation of resources. So that's it in a nutshell. I leave this slide here, just a summary of what I've been discussing. I think I used up quite a bit of time, so I'm very happy to take comments and questions now.
Thank you very much, Gaaitzen. That was great. Does anyone have any does anyone have any comments or questions? Please feel free to jump in.
So yes, two quick questions. One is, when you are comparing between Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, are you manufacturing effects? Are you comparing likes with likes? Are they both small and medium enterprises? I thought you were referring to that. So that was one clarification I had in mind. The second is, if you are looking at only at the small and medium enterprises, I mean, is that the reason, perhaps? I mean, then the question comes, what is to be done about it? You know, why isn't manufacturing giving the reduction in poverty as it is doing in Asia? Well, any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yes, and I must apologize then immediately for not elaborating upon the type of data that we are using here for manufacturing. If you attended the presentation by Bertolt Herrendorf on Wednesday, he discussed more elaborately about the manufacturing data that's being used here. And it's comparing likes with likes. So what you have is you have basically the entire, or an attempt to cover the entire manufacturing sector, both in Africa and in developing Asia. So yeah, I know where your question is coming from. I talked about it. A lot of the industrialization appears to originate from small-scale manufacturing in Africa, but we look at both. So both at small and large. It's just the aggregate manufacturing that we're looking at.
Are there any further questions?
Any reason why that is happening? You know, why is Asia doing better than? Sorry, I interrupted.
So please carry on, Ahmad.
My question was, you know, to any sort of any ideas on why there is this a bigger, more significant effect in Asia in manufacturing? I mean, I understand the scale is bigger in Asia, but relatively, is the scale much smaller in Africa in the terms of impact on manufacturing?
It's a very interesting question, and perhaps that would be the sequel on the next annual conference. Actually, we are looking into, we're developing new data, in particular time series supply and use tables for African countries, where we're looking into this question to investigate whether structural change in Africa originates from the demand side, which would contrast with structural change in Asia that would originate from the supply side. The supply side theory would be that there's productivity growth originating in manufacturing that's driving industrialization and structural change there. That essentially it's a rise in income, perhaps from rising commodity prices or other sources that is leading to demand-driven structural change in Africa, instead of actually these productivity improvements taking place in manufacturing in Africa. So it's a very interesting question. I would say stay tuned until the next round, hopefully.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Hi, Gaaitzen. Did you
Hi,
look
Arnold.
at the differences in manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa? I suppose that it's not all subsectors of manufacturing that are productivity growth is decreasing. In fact, some sectors productivity growth is comparable to that of countries like Czech Republic. So did you look at the heterogeneity in the manufacturing sector?
That's a very valid point. There is substantial cross-country heterogeneity. Not in this paper. So indeed, I take that as a good comment for this paper. Not in this paper, but in the other paper, we do carefully investigate this country heterogeneity. But you rightly point out, I mean, I can extend this attribution exercise to individual countries to examine this country heterogeneity.
All right, well, thank you very much, Hudson, for your presentation. The next session will be starting in about 8 minutes or so. I think we'll be moving back to the main room soon. However, if anyone does have a final question before the room closes.
I'd be happy to ask a question if there's time. Very interesting presentation, and I think very important to connect structural change to poverty reduction, because it's a more tangible, not more tangible, but more immediate thing than some of the more abstract concepts we talk about. I wonder about some of these poverty measures, because you're looking very much at things over time. But of course, this $1.90 a day headcount ratio is static, and $1.90 is not the same in 1990 as it was in 2018. That's obviously as much a fault of the standardized measure. But I wonder if there was any way to incorporate a relative poverty concept or a moving price adjusted poverty concept into it as well, just to bring in that feature. Thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thanks. That's a very good comment. That's actually what we do in the paper as well. So we look here at the headcount ratio, but in the paper we actually consider several extensions, among others the poverty gap ratio, right, which gets closer to what you're suggesting at, how far you are from that poverty line. We do prefer to use an absolute poverty line, as we're interested here in comparing effects across countries. But the poverty gap ratio captures that both of these elements. Now, the main results that you see here, that structural change actually relates to poverty reduction, and that productivity within sectors also relates to poverty reduction, carries over if you use that measure.
Thanks again. I think we'll be closing the breakout room very soon.
Thanks for your attention. Happy to take any further questions later on in the conference.